Well, thank you, Jake, and I am delighted to be here. I'd also like to thank Dr. Jenny Hamilton and the faculty in the Department of Rhetoric for inviting me, and also to the friends and former students and family of the late William Norwood Brigance. It is my deep honor to be here on an occasion that remembers him and his work. Actually, last September at the Public Address Conference in Pittsburgh, I happened to have dinner with two previous Brigance Forum speakers, and I happened to mention that I had been invited here, and one exclaimed, "Oh my Lord, you're giving the Brigance Lecture. They're so friendly there." I think he was clearly impressed with his visit here. Now, Professor Brigance's work altered our field in the 20th century, and I think it's fitting on this occasion to remember a scholar, a professor, and an influence in this field that firmly located the study of rhetoric in the humanities. I can recall the impression that his seminal book, Public Address, The History of Public Address, had on me as a junior at the University of Richmond, in Richmond College, when I first read that. Professor Brigance believed in the pivotal role of great speakers and speech and the role they play in public life. Ideas he thought thoughtfully crafted, well-spoken, can inform decisions and guide a nation. It's a thesis, I think, that's good to revisit, especially when some question our ability as a public to thoughtfully address great issues before us. Now, one who has raised such doubts is your own respected former member of the U.S. Congress and co-chair of the 9/11 Commission, Lee Hamilton. Now, in an interview that he gave last October for the National Public Radio, Hamilton said, "I am deeply concerned about the future of my country. We're confronted with a very large number of very, very difficult problems. They come at us with great rapidity and great complexity. And whether or not the system, the constitutional system that we have can meet these challenges, I think should be a deep concern to all Americans." Hamilton then went on to say that when Lincoln spoke at Gettysburg, the country was deeply divided. But the politician of that day, he said, dealt with a relatively small number of issues. What happens today, he said to a politician, is that they have to deal with a very large number of issues of enormous complexity. And I don't think it's a given, he said. I don't think it's written in the stars that we will always survive and prosper. I believe Hamilton's correct. The issues confronting us, and indeed the nation, now are extraordinarily complex. Global financial stability, human rights and the struggle for democracies, energy policy, and the issue that's engaged me deeply for the last 5 years, global climate change. Now, Lee Hamilton was not speaking about climate change, though he well could have. But the scale and complexity of the changes that would be required to address this issue are unparalleled. How do we transform global structures of energy production, transportation, and pricing, and what are called the sunk carbon costs, the capital investments in these systems, as well as the economic and the regulatory systems that undergird them? As Michael Hume, the director of the prestigious Tyndall Research Center for Climate Change, points out, climate change and its implications is an idea that, quote, circulates anxiously in our politics, in our businesses, in religion, and in every aspect of social life. I think nowhere is this anxiety seen as much as in popular media, cable TV talk shows, and pseudo-documentaries such as The Great Global Warming Swindle, as well as cartoonists and TV commentators for whom every snowstorm is a fodder for the failures of Al Gore or proof that global warming doesn't exist. Now, I've asked myself many times, and I've worked with this issue now for a number of years, why is it that climate change or climate science, admittedly issues of enormous complexity, why are these so prone to contentiousness, to prone to hyperbole, ad hominem, and cynicism in our public life. My broader question, however, is this. Are democratic publics committed to the idea that our best decisions arise from scrutiny and debate also capable of addressing great complexities? And if not, what then are the barriers to doing so? And where within the communicative spaces of our public life do these barriers arise? Now, I pose these questions because implicit in them is a more troubling question about the adjudication of knowledge itself. So in my time with you, I want to argue that there are accelerating changes in the sites of production and the distribution of knowledge about science that hinder our understanding of complexity. And further, that these changes are contributing to an epistemic uncertainty, not only about global warming, but about science itself. So to begin, I believe we are witnessing a curious disconnect. At a time when scientific organizations in every major country in the world report strong consensus on this, opinion polls in the US reflect a growing disbelief in climate change. For example, the National Research Council of the American Academies of Science recently restated its own conclusion that, quote, climate change is occurring and is caused largely by human activities, end of quote. At the same time, however, an ABC Washington Post survey finds that only a minority, 36%, believe that there is a scientific consensus on this. And a number of Americans, 62%, in fact, believe that there is a lot of disagreement among scientists. Now, at times, this disconnect can be rather stark. This past winter, Fox TV's Glenn Beck, whose show draws 2 million viewers, joked that if global warming is happening, why is my car buried under all this snow? Now, how many of you asked that same questions this winter? Now, at the same time, however, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, reported that the global surface temperatures in 2010 tied as the warmest year on record. The record's beginning in 1880, and it was the 34th consecutive year with global temperatures above the 20th century average. 2010 also ended the warmest decade since these records began. And more. A new survey finds that fully half of the newly elected Republicans in Congress deny outright that climate change is real. Yet at the same time, the NATO Supreme Commander in Europe has warned that global warming, quote, could lead to conflict, quote, as a result of the speed of Arctic ice melting, opening this region to competition over the valuable minerals that's in that area. And in fact, the Kodiak Kenai Cable Telecommunications Company has announced that because global warming is melting so much Arctic ice that, quote, it's starting this year to lay fiber optic cable through the Northwest Passage, which was unthinkable just a few years ago. Finally, New York Times columnist Paul Krugman has voiced the frustration of many scientists when he wrote that climate scientists en masse have become like the Greek goddess Cassandra, gifted with the ability to prophesy future disasters, but cursed with the inability to get anyone to believe them. So what's happening? Are scientists cursed with Cassandra's curse, or is it that simply they are poor communicators? Or in the face of the recent recession, is that climate change and energy policy simply is no longer salient in the face of job insecurity, debt, and other financial burdens? I think there's some evidence for this latter. A Pew Research poll finds that only 28% of Americans believe that climate change should be a, quote, top domestic priority, putting it last behind jobs and the economy. A new Gallup poll last week found that only 51% said that they actually worry even somewhat about climate change or global warming. and that's been down from 66% who worried about it just 2 years ago. Now, I believe it would be wrong, though, to attribute this disbelief simply to the economy. I believe something else is happening. Opinion surveys also show that Americans are uncertain about the basic theses of climate science itself and whether scientists themselves even believe that warming is occurring. For example, 48% of Americans believe that the seriousness of global warming is, quote, exaggerated. This is the highest skepticism in Gallup's survey since it first asked this question in 1997. Similarly, in the last 3 to 4 years, there's been a growing uncertainty that human activities play any significant role in global warming. And there has been increasing uncertainty as to whether scientists believe such warming is actually occurring. Finally, a survey by Yale University finds a small but disturbing trend. Trust in scientists themselves has declined almost 10% in just the last 2 years. The principal investigator for this survey told CNN that, quote, this is a steep drop-off, and this despite the fact that climate science is getting stronger. Now, first, let's be clear. Climate science is hard to communicate. It is complex. Even the phrase global warming is misleading. We're invited to think of it as slow, occurring evenly, and happening everywhere at the same time. So it seems counterintuitive that there could be winter snows in the Midwest at the same time that droughts are spreading in the Southwest, and temperatures in the northeast of Canada and Greenland this winter are running 15 to 20 degrees warmer than usual. And then add the complexities of the climate system itself, that there are both positive and negative forcings, that is, multiple and opposed changes in the balance of energy in the climate system that contribute to warming or cooling or both, and positive feedback loops. For example, albedo effects in the Arctic, the effects on Arctic ice differing from the effects of sunlight on open, dark ocean water. And where once the ice begins to melt, with more open water revealed, a cycle of warming becomes self-sustaining, and warming continues absent even the effect of human causes. And most importantly, the fact that changes in the climate system are often overdetermined. That is to say, that shifts in the energy balance in the Earth's system are the result not only of positive and negative forcings, but also from natural as well as anthropogenic or human influences. So in the face of this complexity, it's tempting to say the climate's always changed. It's all just natural variation. But it's another thing, however, for scientists to try to explain to journalists and how they write about the regression models that scientists rely upon to calculate the net residual influence of each of these forcings, both natural and human. It's not surprising then that a Yale University survey finds that most Americans, quote, remain seriously confused as to the causes of climate change. Only a tiny fraction, 8%, know enough about the science to be awarded an A or a B, and fully 52%, based on their knowledge of the science, would get an F. But if the problem were simply the lack of public education, then the answer is clear. We need better science communication and media that translates competently scientific expertise for a lay audience. As former Brigance Forum speaker Josiah Ober of Stanford said, the challenge then would be, quote, to how to put that knowledge dispersed across many individuals and across all levels of society into action, end of quote. Now, I agree, but I fear the problem is more complex. The challenge of today's democracy is not simply how to put knowledge into action, but how public knowledge itself is produced, and by whom and with what effect. Now, as I proposed a moment ago, I believe that there are accelerating changes in the production and distribution of such knowledge that may be hindering our understanding of complexity and furthermore that these changes are contributing to a deeper uncertainty not only about climate change, but about climate science itself. First, the challenge for journalists in reporting the complexities of global warming or science comes at a time of crisis in the traditional model, business model of media. As newspapers declare bankruptcy or migrate online, the expertise available in newsrooms continues to decline. Parallel with this, we're seeing a resurgence, especially in the US, of an ideological opposition to climate science that's been able to exploit the openings created by these business trends. These openings include the growth of alternative news and commentary platforms and sites of knowledge production online, in popular cable news, on radio talk shows, and second, an expanding distribution network of aggregators that are able to exploit the decline of science journalism by circulating alternative, cynical, yet populist narratives to wider media outlets. So let me illustrate these trends briefly and then describe some of the steps that scientists and some reporters are taking to address them, but also a larger challenge to the communication discipline itself. First, let's recall that the coverage of climate change is occurring at a time of ongoing crisis in the business model of traditional media. As Bud Ward, the editor of the Yale Forum on Climate Change in the Media, said recently, it's hard for reporters to focus on ambitious climate reporting when their ranks are being carnaged. He's referring not simply to the so-called death of newspapers, but to the downsizing of news staff and expertise as news media lose revenue, cut circulation, and migrate online. Now, the Pew Center's 2011 State of the News Media, released just last week, gives us some insight, I think, into what's happening in the industry lately. While revenue for some media, television, broadcast, online, after years of decline has begun to bounce back, income for newspapers continues to drop, falling almost 50% in just the last 4 years. So the sharp drop in revenue has left newspapers downsizing everything: the size of the paper, the space devoted to news, and most painfully, the number of reporters. Overall, the Pew's State of the News Media found that newspapers had now lost over 25% in daily circulation just since 2000. As a result, newsrooms are now 30% smaller than in 2000. This, the Pew study concludes, has, quote, left the largest newsrooms in most American cities bruised and necessarily less ambitious than they were a decade ago. And while online versions are springing up, these still depend on news staff to produce content, and therein lies the problem. When the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, its primary newspaper, moved online recently, it slashed a news staff of 165 reporters and began operating online with only 20. As a result, the Pew study finds, quote, even the best of the online new media sites still have limited ability to produce content. And that capacity ultimately will depend upon finding a revenue model that is far larger than what they have today. Now, as media cut staff, there is inevitably a loss of science expertise. Some newspapers and online versions are eliminating entire beats. The San Jose Mercury newspaper reports that, quote, 2 decades ago, nearly 150 papers in the U.S. had a science section. Now, fewer than 20 are left, and these usually dedicate their scarce column inches to lifestyle and health issues. The Yale Forum on Climate Change and the media put it bluntly, quote, the ranks of reporters best equipped to cover major environmental and climate change stories at most news outlets, particularly in local markets, are being decimated. The trend is similar at network news staff in cable TV. In 2008, for example, CNN cut its entire science, technology, and environment news staff. And the Weather Channel eliminated its weekly climate program, Forecast Earth. With its news staff cut, cable news is increasingly filling its time slot with opinion journalism. Now, at the same time that newsrooms shrink, the State of the News media reports that the number of non-journalist players entering the information and news field is growing rapidly. These newer players include corporations, ideological think tanks, activist bloggers, and online pass-through sites or aggregators. Now, aggregators like Yahoo or Google News are sites that collect a wide variety of web content, as you know, headlines, podcasts, tweets, videos, posts in the blogosphere, and repost these in a single location available for easy distribution to media outlets. Now, as a result, the production of climate news and commentary is now generated increasingly in an information milieu of alternative media platforms, sources of knowledge claims, and ideological agendas. Climate skeptics especially have proven adept at exploiting the decline in traditional science journalism and the explosive growth at the same time of these online sites. One of the most popular of these aggregators is the conservative The Drudge Report. You've heard of it. It's known for its provocative daily headlines available for download by the producers of cable news and other outlets. Drudge is also a prolific aggregator of sensational news and comment about climate change, often reposting commentary from skeptics' blogs and other non-science sources of knowledge. Its headlines have included, quote, Obama, climate czar, has socialist ties, quote, global warming, global cooling, 30 years of warming temperature go poof. Now, as a result, I think it's more likely that a cynical story about climate change, if it has enough edge, will more quickly be distributed by an aggregator like Drudge than would a report from a leading science journal. For example, Drudge, which gets over 2 million hits daily and 14 distinct visitors monthly from reporters, editors, cable news producers, and individuals searching for headlines that attract audiences. Consider this headline, for example, used by Fox News last January. 30 years of global cooling are coming, leading scientist says. And the report goes on, quote, from Miami to Maine, Savannah to Seattle, America is caught in an icy grip, which one of the UN's top global warming proponents says could mark the beginning of a mini ice age. It could just be the beginning of a decades-long deep freeze, says Professor Mojib Latif, one of the world's leading climate modelers. End of quote from Fox. Now, at the time of this report, Fox News placed top of the most-watched cable network news programs, logging the most viewers in prime time with 3.2 million viewers. And Dr. Latif from the Leibniz Institute in Germany is, in fact, one of the world's leading climate modelers. There was only one problem with the Fox News report: it was blatantly false. When a reporter phoned Dr. Latif to fact-check the story and his quote, Latif replied, quote, I don't know what to do. They just make these things up, end of quote. Now, the source of the Fox News era is instructive. It apparently appeared initially in a post online entitled The Mini Ice Age Starts Here. The blogger had misquoted Dr. Latif, but the post was picked up quickly by the Drudge Report and distributed to other bloggers, to cable news producers, and they posted it finally on Fox News. Now, Latif himself had already objected to the misquoting of his research. 2 months earlier, he told the National Public Radio that climate skeptics were misusing his work to suggest that we were headed for a period of, quote, global cooling. His research, he explained, had merely suggested a few years' hold in temperatures when human-caused warming might be partly offset by ocean cycles. Quote, these short-term changes, he said, are much smaller than the long-term warming trends. So we are not talking about a net cooling. After this hold, he said, warming would accelerate once again. Now, eras do occur in news stories. My point, though, is simply that this trend is more likely as newsrooms cut their staff, including editors and fact-checkers, and as a result, misleading or ideologically driven stories more easily survive and are distributed more rapidly. Now, to be fair, the rise of aggregator sites can serve science as well. NOAA, NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, and other scientific agencies have their sites which gather and distribute high-quality climate research to the public. Yet for every NASA or NOAA website, there are far more numerous sites by climate skeptics, as well as the platforms that aggregate and distribute skeptics' views to wider audiences. Sites such as Climate Depot, AirVent, the Heartland Institute, as well as Drudge, are able to facilitate rapid distribution of climate anomalies and skeptical commentary across multiple platforms. And indeed, they now function as the alternative news feed for many mainstream news organizations. Now, Pew's State of the News Media report last week put it more bluntly, quote, in the digital realm, the news industry is no longer in control of its own destiny. With each technological advance, it said, a new layer of complexity, a new set of players have been added in connecting news content to readers and viewers. These intermediaries, aggregators, programmers, mobile device makers, increasingly control access to the public. Now, as a result, our knowledge of science, gathered by aggregators like Drudge, is more likely to sustain narratives of uncertainty and cynicism about climate change. Consider the story of ClimateGate, the most pernicious of these narratives. Just weeks before the December 2009 UN Climate Summit in Copenhagen, hackers broke into computers at the University of East Anglia in the UK and downloaded over 1,000 personal emails from leading climate scientists. Skeptic bloggers jumped on the story. They alleged that the emails exposed a, quote, scandal, quote, a hoax, quote, a conspiracy by scientists to fudge their result and silence their critics. Fanned by the Drudge Report and Fox News, the ClimateGate story went viral, and it served up headlines for cable news and newspapers across the United States. The leaked emails, the stories alleged were a, quote, smoking gun, evidence that scientists had conspired to manipulate data to support their views that climate change is occurring and is caused by human influence. The British newspaper, The Telegraph, called it, quote, the worst scientific scandal in modern history. Within a week after a blogger coined the term ClimateGate, Google listed over 9 million hits. Now, ironically, newspaper coverage of global warming had been declining in the US from a high of around 2006 and 2007, the year that Gore's An Inconvenient Truth documentary came out. Since then, declining pretty steadily, except for the period when the ClimateGate story broke, then coverage of climate change spiked. Typical was the discussion in one paper that, quote, we have discovered that a good portion of the science used to justify, quote, climate change was a hoax, perpetuated by leftist ideologues with an agenda. Indeed, polls during this period of the American public showed that the US public was very likely to believe, or somewhat likely, to believe that scientists had falsified their results. Prominent climatologists received death threats. Phil Jones, the director of the Climate Research Unit at East Anglia, told a reporter, quote, "People said I should go and kill myself," quote. The death threats, he said, were coming from all over the world. The real scandal, however, turned out to be not the science, but the media's stumbling in the face of the unproven allegations and the story frames that were just too juicy not to publish. In months after the story broke, no fewer than 6 major independent investigations in the US and in the UK had cleared the scientists of charges that they had tampered with their research and exonerated the underlying science itself. The investigations were conducted by 3 universities, the British House of Commons Science and Technology Committee, and even the US Commerce Department's Inspector General. They did find that some of the scientists used intemperate language and ridiculed their skeptic critics. The most serious of the findings against the scientists, that some were overly cautious and were refusing to share their raw data with their worst critics. None of the inquiries, however, found anything in the emails to question the basic science. Despite these findings, however, many people were left wondering whether climate change was really as much of a threat as it had been advertised. Now, the reason for this is not hard to find. On his CNN Sunday news show, Reliable Sources, Howard Kurtz pointed to the disparity between the amount of coverage that ClimateGate had received in the media when the controversy first came public versus the much smaller amount of media attention that it got after the investigations had cleared the scientist. Kurtz noted, for example, that when the hacked emails were first leaked, Fox's TV Glenn Beck called global warming, quote, "a big hoax," and asked, with no sense of irony, why no network had covered this global warming hoax. Yet after the inquiries that exonerated the scientist, Beck had no comment. Now, while the ClimateGate stories have died down, similar narratives of scandal, falsifying of data, charges of unethical behavior by climate scientists continue to percolate on skeptic blogs and are stirred by aggregators and distributed to mainstream outlets. Aggregators like Drudge, for example, in just the last 2 weeks, still feature headlines such as 2010 tied for the hottest year? Relax, it's purely a political statement. And close the EPA, it's time to stop carbon funding for mysticism with taxpayer dollars. Now, as a result, I believe we have what German sociologist Ulrich Beck has identified as the prime question of our age. What counts as proof, he asked, in a world where both knowledge and lack of knowledge are inextricably fused? The old model of news, media monopoly, singular, authoritative, is dead. The question is whether another ideal is yet possible. With information sources and opinion proliferating, the evidence is not good that we have the ability yet to think critically or to judge complexities in scale with the amount of information bits now available. The challenges, though, I think extend beyond the problems that I've just outlined. I believe that those of us and the graduating senior rhetoric majors have before us is to rethink not just the crisis in legacy or traditional news media, but the actually existing sources of social knowledge, their modes of production, and their sites of distribution to a broader public. Now, there are, in fact, some encouraging initiatives, and I'd like to end with these and the challenge to our field. There are some signs from scientists and reporters alike from communication scholars and others that they recognize the problem of how to engage the actually existing sites where new social knowledge is circulated, if not from scientists themselves. The Union of Concerned Scientists, for example, has launched one of the most comprehensive websites covering the basics of climate science, but also the big picture solutions to the impacts of warming that are already underway. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute has just announced plans to spend $60 million in an effort to raise the nation's awareness through producing high-quality videos for the general public. And ClimateCentral.com, an independent, nonprofit journalism and research organization, has just launched a site to, quote, help mainstream Americans understand how climate change connects to them locally, with breaking news, links to interactive graphics to bring home the story of climate change to the places where we live and work. Finally, in an effort to engage media producers directly, the Yale Forum on Climate Change and the Media has hosted a series of meetings between top climate scientists and media producers, publishers, editors, and others to aid in their understanding of the science and then to help them in communicating the science to the public. Two interesting initiatives have come since then. First, over 100 scientists have just launched the Climate Science Rapid Response Team. The team makes climate scientists available on short notice to reporters or even to talk show or TV hosts for debate with climate skeptics. Second, the American Geophysical Union, probably the premier science organization for climate scientists, has just begun an interactive online Q&A forum with over 700 scientists taking shifts around the clock to answer journalists' questions or to interact with the news media. Both of these initiatives are an attempt to fill in some of the void created by the cutback in newsrooms and in reporters. But I still have to say that better science communication can only take us so far. The changes I've tried to identify this evening in the production of knowledge also ask us to look at how something is constructed as a problem in the first place. How do science reports or even cynical blog posts construct a phenomenon such as climate change as something we should care about or not care about, particularly care about this specifically in a world with competing bits of information for our attention? How democratic publics come to embrace something as a problem was the question that engaged the great American pragmatist philosopher John Dewey in the early 20th century. Dewey taught us, and as students of rhetoric, I think we surely know, that there is no simple linear relationship between information on one hand and a concern about something on the other. Dewey suggested that something becomes a concern or a problem within a context of personal, affective motivations, a dim feeling of trouble, or a disruption of our habits and thinking. So it is with these issues that climate scientists struggle to educate us about a set of facts which, if rightly told, disturb our habits of mind and our habits of thinking. Most nations have already reached this plane. For them, climate change is a serious problem, and they've moved the debate beyond whether it's occurring to how best to begin to adapt to the changes that are already occurring. Changing the dates for planting and harvesting of crops, building seawalls, changes in banking and insurance policies, the regional pooling of risks are just some of the initiatives now occurring in developing nations and major industrial nations beyond our borders. In the United States, climate change remains a contentious debate, at times a not-so-serious debate, more sarcasm than science. As a consequence, I believe the great question for us is the possibility of media that is at once open, democratic, pluralistic, but also a media that enables us to become competent to understand and to make sense of complexities and what courses of actions we shall, as a people, take. Frankly, I think most of us don't need to know the intricacies of regression models or the threshold levels for carbon dioxide in order to judge ocean acidity or the failure of crops or the loss of coral reefs. As Susan Hassel, the Director of Climate Communication at the University of Colorado at Boulder, puts it, the broader question before us is not in the end a technical one. For example, do we stabilize atmospheric CO2 at 400 parts per million or 440 parts per million? Rather, she says, the question is, what kind of people are we? In answering this, I can hear Professor Brigance reminding us that the rhetorical arts still have a place in our debates. For since Aristotle and the debates in the ancient agora of Athens, the rationale for rhetoric has come from its root, its etymological root, the word rhetor. The term signifies both someone who could speak well, but also who was a citizen. Rhetor assumed a democratic people, ones who not only could speak well, but govern well. Athenians had a responsibility to merge the two, language and civic judgment. Our fate then need not be Cassandra's. I think not doomed to speak, but not have others listen. We still have a say in the accountability and the uses of the systems of media and communication that we use. But more importantly, we ourselves have the capacity still for scrutiny and judgment, our ability to insist on standards of evidence, of probity, and of sound argument. These are the ars rhetorica, the Greek term for the arts that Professor Brigance taught and that is still insisted upon by departments of rhetoric, such as here at Wabash College. We still face issues that come at us with great rapidity and great complexity. But I think we need not turn just to the scientist, but to the rhetor, those among us whose seriousness of speech and discernment is still the hope of a democratic society. So thank you. Okay.
We have a few minutes for questions. Is there anybody that has a question or reflection on Dr. Cox's presentation this evening?
Have at it.
reporters trained in the science beat, but like you said, they're drawn to climate gate because it appeals to classic news values of conflict and novelty. Their inclination to balance between two opposing voices gives access and a voice to the skeptics.
Could everyone hear what are the journalist practices themselves that might contribute to this growing disbelief? I think that there are two issues related in your question. On the one hand, as newsrooms cut staff and the remaining reporters covering the environment or the science beat, less training, they are more likely to accept competing views as to the truth. So on the one hand, science says, but on the other hand, a leading skeptic says. And I think that's an abandonment of the journalist's responsibility. It is to be open in the research phase to look at all sources of opinion, but in reporting, one draws a conclusion about what is true. And I think a journalist has a responsibility to dig down into the knowledge of her or his own field.
What do you think the role of the university and colleges are in this whole context?
already collaboration beginning between science departments and the humanities and the social sciences. One of the slides I had not gotten to is just a sampling of some of the new publications, initiatives, research centers. The George Mason University Center for Climate Change Communication, I think, is doing tremendous work in doing studies of how better to communicate the science to everyday publics. So I think producing relevant knowledge to the ongoing debate to aid science, but also to aid the public in understanding and being able to render judgment, I think is still a task of the university.
Maybe just a follow-up question. I think, a small liberal arts college like Wabash College is designing. We don't have this huge science department. But
I mean, let's be fair. It's not your role right now to convince ExxonMobil to switch to clean energy fuel. It's your role right now to get as good an education as you can, because I will put money on the fact that virtually every one of you will be in leadership positions in this society in some years, in different sectors, in business, in government, in nonprofit work. And in those sectors, you have influence. And the sources of change in our society come from all vectors. And you cannot substitute the strength of your education, particularly in a liberal arts college like at Wabash. So do the best you can now, and there will be time to contribute in mega ways later, and you'll know them when you come.
I think the role of sort of politics and how this became sort of a Republican versus Democrat issue, like, how do you think that kind of plays? I feel like that plays a major role in the skepticism, continued skepticism.
There is irony in that not only scientists and environmentalists have come around on this issue, but many major corporations in America, Walmart, for example, the US military, insurance companies, all accept the basic theses of climate science. The one sector that has the greatest difficulty is politics. You're spot on in that. There are multiple reasons. Anytime you have a controversial issue that can become a wedge issue that advantages one party over the other by forcing the issue, then it's going to be elevated into political discourse because there's a self-advantage in promoting a wedge issue like that. On the other hand, one need not be a big cynic to trace the money in terms of political campaign contributions and the interested parties that contribute to one party or the other. Fossil fuel interests do not give as much money to the opposing party as they do to the GOP. Yes, sir.
The amount of media that this topic received when it was sort of first brought to the public, that was so staggering. It seemed like the media was almost saturated with that sort of information. Do you think that perhaps people just got burnt out on hearing about it and sort of lost interest due to that, with the creation of the movie Day After Tomorrow and just constantly every day on the news hearing about this issue, that maybe their interest died out?
Question, and there's been a lot of study of this. Much of the discourse surrounding an inconvenient truth, for example, is what we call apocalyptic rhetoric. Warnings of the horrendous consequences that can and are beginning to occur from climate change. And yet we know in the psychology of persuasion that so-called appeals to fear cause an inverse psychological response on the part of audiences. We tend to shut down. Our psychological defenses go up. I was talking with a class earlier that Dr. Hamilton teaches about this. And I think the approach that is gaining more support now is attempting to tie the effects of climate change to the regions where we live, where different people live. For example, the former Republican governor of Utah, Jon Huntsman, was a strong advocate of taking climate change seriously. And a reporter asked why, here in conservative Utah, would the governor take this stance? And Huntsman said, look around you. The snowpack in the Wasatch Range is getting smaller each year. Not only does Salt Lake City and the valley depend upon the snowmelt from that source for our drinking water, but our economy depends upon the tourism from those that ski at Snowbird and the other ski resorts in the Wasatch. That it's ground zero here in terms of the effects of climate change. And we can debate its causes perhaps, but we need to adapt now to the reality that threatens interests that we have.
Also during your lecture that the quality of journalism and therefore the quality of the climate science coverage could improve if different new revenue models were introduced to the media industry. How likely is that to happen, and how would you foresee that?
Well, March 28th, the New York Times will cease publishing its print edition for readers outside New York City. And it will invite those with those existing home deliveries of the paper to become subscribers to online service. So the New York Times is experimenting, and there's a lot of risk in retaining the readership in terms of being able to generate new revenue sources, and that in turn can invest in new staff and so forth. Dr. Abbott?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay. Yes, behind you.
Do you think that what has happened in Japan with the tsunami and all this stuff, that's going to have an effect on the communications and how the media is going to approach climate change?
I think we don't know yet because the crisis is still unfolding. Reactor number 3 is still creating enormous anxiety. I think one thing it is making clear, however, is that those attempting to cover the story are realizing they need greater expertise in nuclear issues, for example. And as a result of the Gulf oil spill, we need greater expertise in order to understand one of the greatest stories breaking on our very shores in the last summer. So my hope is that as environmental catastrophes occur, there is a dawning awareness we need to make investments in knowledge to understand the world around us when these things are hitting us in the face, visually, if not literally.
Do we have one more? No? Okay. Please join us for refreshments in Littell lobby and a chance to continue conversations with Dr. Cox. And please join me in thanking Dr. Cox for coming and delivering his
Thank you.